All right, so the title of my presentation is Advantages and Disadvantages to Crop Livestock Integration. Now, a lot of these responses that I'm going to cover and the information, you're going to know exactly because I'm just stating your words specifically. And so if you recall during the first round of interviews, and some of you when we said the second round, we'd ask you some questions like, what do you like most about how you farm? Or what do you like least about how you farm? Or what would it take for you to add this? Or what would it take for you to drop this? So really, these results are why we're asking those questions. And like Doug said, most of you are farming to fit your lifestyle, but we just want to see additional pathways for crop and livestock integration. Now, the purpose of this presentation is kind of how the slides are going to follow. So the main thing is we want to understand the advantages and disadvantages of different farming approaches. Again, it's those questions, what do you like most and what do you like least about your farming approach? Then we want to identify motivations and barriers to integrating crop and livestock parts of farm operations. This is going to be the questions where, what would it take for you to add this? What would it take for you to drop this product? Then we want to identify factors that drive specialization. Really, what are the primary motivations or what are deterrents to make you prohibit you from specializing? Then we want to examine the influence of off-farm work on your farm approach. Now, I just want to note a caveat about this is we're not looking in this presentation how off-farm work influences your farm approach, just why you have off-farm work, what's the advantages and disadvantages, and then as time goes on, we're going to look and see how it influences your farm. Now, a lot of the presentations that we've discussed has really categorized things in your farm class. I'm bringing you back to the ideal farm types because this is your whole operation. We're asking you questions about your entire operation. So again, it's going to be your farm type A. You're going to see numbers in my slides, and that's going to show the number of farmers that were asked that question. So we have 5 farm type A's, we have 5 farm type B's, we have 6 farm type C1s, and then 9 type C2s and 6 type D. So I just want to introduce those numbers so you're not confused in later slides why the numbers are there. In some cases, we do aggregate to all 31 farms, and you'll also see those numbers, and I'll try to point them out as we move along. Now, whenever I'm listening to your interviews and I'm going through the data, I really needed to find a way to categorize the information or the factors that you were presenting to me. And I found 3 common areas, right? Economic, which is going to include your profitability, marketing, input costs, capital investments, risk management, your agronomic, so soil health, crop yield and quality, pest and weed control, animal health, and then also social factors such as individual preference, family values, tradition, and maybe your community and farm neighbors as well. And then we found some that overlap. So that's your farm labor issues or political concerns such as regulations. And then when it comes to disadvantages, a lot of you talked about environmental factors, mainly the weather. So I just wanted to give you an idea of how everything was categorized as we move along. And I'm going to refer back to these major categories whenever we're moving forward. So when we started, right, what do you like most about your farm approach? So these are the advantages that came out for your type A farmers, your cash grain operations. And so advantages were predominantly social and economic. Field work and equipment were primary drivers. I love this quote. I'm an equipment guy. I like to operate equipment. These farmers really loved working on their equipment. They loved field work. They loved being out in the field. And so they also found that having a cash grain operation complemented their off-farm work. Many of these farmers had off-farm work and they needed to find a way to manage the two. It also simplifies their labor demands. I had one farmer that without livestock, their labor requirements are much lower. And so it's a way to manage the two. Your type B farm advantages, right? Those were predominantly social and agronomic. These farmers enjoyed field work or working with equipment. And then this is a new one that came up. They wanted to maintain the family farm. And this includes giving opportunities for their kids to work on their farm, their grandkids to work on their farm, or just maintaining the family farm over generations. And then here, because they're adding the manure application to their operations, they started noting benefits to soil health. I love this quote by another farmer who said, manure over time will build up your soil. So this is what we were finding whenever we were talking to these farmers. Moving to the advantages of your type C1, those were predominantly social and economic. These farmers enjoyed field work and working with cattle or equipment. So it's kind of that boundary between the cash grain operations and then the more pure livestock operations. They liked everything. They also found that having cattle benefits the family. So they noted that it gives an opportunity for their kids or grandkids to actually work and learn, like develop a work ethic when it comes to farming. To show cattle was a big reason why they started introducing livestock onto their operation. And even if these farmers tended to prefer working with livestock, they found that the cash grain operation was really important to their gross farm income. So having an integrated system began to support the farmer full time. These farmers started to not have off-farm work to the same extent that your type A and type B farms did. And then they also found that having a diversity of products spread their risk across the product. So they were able to work full time on the farm, but it was just them, only supported them, not other farm laborers or the household. Now moving to your type C2 advantages, these were predominantly agronomic and economic. Having an integrated system with perennial crops benefited the soil health. So we're hearing some of the same things that we heard from our type B and type C1 farmers about their soil health due to the manure, but they also noted that it was organic matter and soil erosion control due to the introduction of perennial crops in their rotation. And they also found that perennials improved their rotation both in terms of yield and feed quality. A lot of these farmers wanted to be able to control the feed that they were feeding their livestock. They were concerned more with quality as opposed to cost, right? And then they also found that overall, it reduced their need for off-farm inputs. They weren't needing to seek out, artificial fertilizers because they were already getting those benefits from using manure and perennials in their rotation. And similar to your type C1 farms, it spreads the risk. They weren't invested in just one product. Their gross farm income didn't rely on just one product. And I love this quote, the fertilizer savings is huge and the soil health is huge. And that's not just applying to, applicable to manure use on the farm. It's also that integrated manure and perennial use. And then moving to the type D advantages, these were a little bit more difficult to untangle. I found that they were social, agronomic, and economic. These farmers really enjoyed cattle or their overall approach. Some of these farmers noted outright that if they didn't have livestock, they would not be farming. They also found that having this really focused perennial operation as opposed to having the cash grains, it reduced their labor, facilities, and equipment requirements by grazing. And I do want to note this following quote is specific to a grazing operation, but these fields are also mechanically hay harvest. So just be aware that it includes mechanically harvested fields and also forages. So I think by having perennial permaculture pasture, you end up having healthy soils, healthy plants, healthy cows, and healthy consumers. Now, not only did I want to look at the advantages by each farm type, I wanted to look at commonalities across all farm types. And I found that social factors were the primary advantage. Individual preference, it really came down to individual preference why you were farming the way you farm. I love this quote, especially because it's from a farmer who is a grain operator who no longer has livestock. I'd a whole lot rather be out in the shop working on equipment or be out in the field if I had a choice. Being in the barn was a kind of like a punishment. So some of these farmers set up their operations so that they would not be able to have livestock on it. But then you also get the opposite end where these farmers, like I said, your type Ts, they would not be farming if they did not have livestock. And I noticed even with our C1s and type C2s, if they had to simplify, no matter what, they would still have a handful of livestock on their operation. And then I found the other really important thing was family or tradition. Again, many of you wanted to keep the farm in the family at any cost. You also you enjoyed having that opportunity to work on the farm with your kids or grandkids. And I love this quote, a good part of why dad and my grandfather and his dad gave me the opportunity to farm, I would like to give my son that same opportunity. I mean, these farmers, even if they have off-farm work or they think that their kids aren't going to necessarily want to be on the farm in the future, they don't want them to lose that opportunity. Then a really common thing that came up, in a third of the farmers was soil health. So your agronomic factors was really important. You're thinking, how can I maintain this land for future generations, not just for myself right now? And then we're moving to the disadvantages. So the question about what do you like least about how you farm, or having the crop and livestock products on your operation. And so I kind of grouped these with your type A, type B, and type D. And then I go into type C and C2. And the reason why is not many of you listed disadvantages, right, to the same extent that you listed advantages. So whenever it comes to your type A farms, the disadvantages were predominantly economic. You're thinking about marketing and your costs for your off-farm inputs, also the prices that you receive for your product, because you tend to only have corn or soybeans, sometimes another grain. And then our type B farms, they had very similar listed economic disadvantages as your type A, but then we also noticed some agronomic and environmental disadvantages. And that's mainly associated with application of manure to their fields. How are they going to get their manure, right? Because they're not getting it on their farm. Is it going to cause compaction? Am I going to be able to apply it when I need to apply it? And then weather as well, which is often linked to manure application. Are the conditions going to be suitable for spreading manure whenever I can even get my hands on the manure? And then your disadvantages for your type D farms were predominantly environmental, and that dealt with weather. Again, a major concern is the weather going to cooperate whenever I want to spread manure? But there's another side of that. They also noted that they had some major issues working with livestock during the winter, during the cold months, having to get water out there. And so it's a slightly different, but there are similarities, as you can see, between these three types. Then whenever we move to the disadvantages for your type C1 and type C2 farms, we noticed that for type C1, they're predominantly social and economic. And the main thing was their time commitments and bottlenecks. And the reason why this is there's still some type C1 farmers that have off-farm work. Not all of them, but a few of them. And so they're struggling with time commitments, meeting their off-farm work needs, their on-farm work needs. But the other component is now they have cash grains and they have livestock. And so they noticed that bottlenecks were a really big issue whenever planting and calving aligned at the same time. And then whenever it comes to your type C2 farms, the disadvantages were predominantly social and economic. They also struggled with some time commitment issues, but they tended to be able to be on the farm more often because they were only working on the farm. And then they also tended to sometimes have farm labor resources too. So these farms tended to be dairies. And so farm labor is always a big issue, right? Who's going to milk in the morning? How am I going to retain these employees? The hours are variable. How can I compete with, other industries? The other thing that I noticed here is they started bringing up regulations concerned with water quality and managing their manure. And are they able to spread according to guidelines that are set? I think this mainly applies to our Western Ohio H2 Ohio members. So the common disadvantages between all farm types, whenever we aggregate, again, it comes to those time commitments and bottlenecks. That was just the issue for everyone across the board. And then weather, environmental, that was another common thing. Again, that's linked to spreading manure, taking care of livestock during the winter. And then another thing that we found was, farm labor. And I really love this quote because I think this really characterizes the issue with securing labor. it would always be nice to have a little more help, but then what do you do with the extra help in the off season? If you're working with part-time help that has no experience and don't know the equipment in the fields and all that, when it boils down to it, it doesn't save you that much time. So then we asked you some questions. I just want to note here, whenever we move to these questions, there's no longer numbers, and that's because responses on these vary. So adding manure, this was really only asked of your type A farmers. And so we asked, what would it take for you to add manure? What are the pros and cons of this? So the pros were soil health. Everyone thought that it was going to benefit their soil health in the long term. There were also some people that noted yield and a reduced reliance on off-farm inputs. It's good for the ground, and obviously they say you can't hide manure when it comes to yield. Now, the cons, many of them voiced soil compaction as the major issue. Then they also noted equipment and facilities. Not all of these farmers had spreaders or access to equipment that would allow them to spread manure. They were also concerned about their farm neighbors, especially if they were living in areas that were becoming more urbanized. Is the odor going to be an issue? What about traffic getting to the manure to my house? And then to a lesser extent, they noted farm labor. Who's going to do this work if I'm off the farm all the time? And then also access. How can I get it? And can it be a reliable source? Another farmer noted weed and pathogen introductions. So this quote states it, the cons are the weeds and seeds that you drag onto your farm and the compaction that is created to get on your farm. So these farmers are really thinking about compaction in these issues. Then we asked some farmers, what would it take for them to add livestock? So again, this is going to be typically your type A and type B farmers that were asked this question. The pros were partnerships. And I want to note, partnerships is a reoccurring theme that arose when asking about diversifying. Farmers would be willing to add livestock to their operation if they partnered with another farmer that would be willing to help cover capital investments and cover some labor requirements when it came to carrying the livestock. They also noted that they would be willing to add livestock if they had a successor or a family member, a kid or a grandkid that was interested in having livestock on the farm operation. And then also harvesting was an issue. That I think is a typo. So I apologize for that. And I want to note the reason why they have asterisks next to them is, again, this is not an individual thing. Like, I'm going to add I'm going to add livestock and it's going to benefit. It has to come with something else, right? They need the partnership, or they need to see some other kinds of benefits to entice them to add it, not just like their inherent value. And then cons, capital investments were the #1 con. Again, individual and family preference. There were some farmers who noted that their kids were not interested in having livestock on the operation. And so it's not something that they would go into because no one has, future successors aren't interested in it. Another thing is age. Some farmers noted that they, just weren't at an age where they could actually bring livestock onto the farm and care for them to the same extent if they were younger. I love this quote because it really captures the pros and the cons. I mean, these things, many of you, whenever you're talking to me, you're not just saying, oh yeah, this is a great benefit. You're telling a story, and it often is two-sided. And so I just love this. My son would like it in referencing to adding livestock. Issues are there are no buildings. The capital investment into buildings would be too high. And then we also asked some farmers, your type A, B, and C1, what it would take for them to add perennials to their operation. And the pros, soil health was the #1 pro. They thought it was going to help with their soil erosion. And so they just thought that it would benefit them that way. The other thing is profits and partnerships. Again, these have asterisks. So profits, some farmers noted that they would add perennials if they felt that it could pay for itself. It's not something that they would just do to add to their rotation. They needed to see some kind of economic benefit. And then partnerships, similar to livestock, they would only do this if they were able to access the equipment needed to harvest the hay, or if they had someone who would provide the labor, or if they had, a successor that was interested in it. And then I just love this quote linked to soil health. There's something about growing forages just the sheer root mass itself, your soil, it's just different. And then cons, again, similar to livestock, is capital investments. That's why they need that partnership. They don't want to be able to just go out and buy a square baler. Then land suitability was another thing that came up. A lot of you are thinking of your area, how the land is used. It's more profitable for your land to be in a cash grain rotation than it is to be in a perennial, hay rotation. The other thing that they know is maybe that erosion is not an issue. It's not hilly, it's flat land. It's really good for growing these cash grains. And then farm labor was another issue, because whenever you are cutting, raking, tedding hay, it takes a lot more work than just harvesting your grains. And then also bottlenecks. So you're only able to harvest your hay at a certain time, and you need to be able to get out there without any hindrances. It is I love this quote, it's a decent financial investment if you're going to make big square bales. And then we asked you, what would it take for you to specialize? And so this is really going to be your type B, C1, C2, and D farmers that were asked these questions. And we did find some motivations to specialize. The main thing was commodity prices. And I just want to say, some of you said, oh yeah, I would specialize, I would focus more on cash grains compared to livestock if corn reached, $15 a bushel. And then right after you would say that, it would be like, but I also realize market fluctuations, so that's not going to stay the same price. So really, I'm probably not going to, I'm not going to specialize. You did note loss of markets. So if you no longer had access to your markets, loss of land, if you no longer had your land to farm on, and if you lost your main source of farm labor. I mean, those are obvious things as to why you would specialize. And in most cases, these aren't things that would happen, yourself. These are things that you can't really control, circumstances you can't necessarily control. Now, overall, most of you listed deterrents because you really love the way that you farm. So the first thing is farm income. Most of you noted that your mix of livestock and crop products really was essential to your farm income. If you lost one of those, you don't think that you could still remain a farmer. The other thing is investment in your equipment and facilities. These things are really expensive. So if you have a barn or a freestyle barn, you don't necessarily want to lose that capital investment. You want to be sure that you're keeping those things in use, right? And then the other thing is preference. Again, like I said, your type D farmers, a lot of them said, if I had no livestock, I would not be farming. Now, whenever we talked about, dropping manure, many of you who are using manure said, no, it's not something I would even think about getting rid of because it's a free nutrient source. And then especially for those C1, C2, and D farms, you know that you have to do something with your manure, right? It's not like the B farms where you don't have livestock on your operation. Those other farms have manure and they have to do something with it. It needs to go somewhere. And then whenever we asked about dropping perennials, the main thing that came up, you're not going to want to stop raising your forages or your hay because you're concerned about the quality of your feed. A lot of you really are particular about the seeds that you pick, how you grow it, when you cut it. You know that the quality, you have a quality that you want to meet that you don't think if you could buy your feed from other people. And so that was one of the main deterrents. And then the last part, we asked you about the advantages and disadvantages about having off-farm work. And then when it comes down to the advantages, the main thing was income. A lot of you talked about how, it was an additional source of income. Some even noted that your off-farm work is why you were able to acquire the land that you have or to get to the size that you were. The other component was health insurance. That was the main thing. A lot of you were concerned at how you would obtain health insurance without off-farm work. Another thing is knowledge. So as Mike noted, sorry to point you out, Mike, many of you who do have off-farm work are actually involved in agriculture for your off-farm work. And so it's a way for you to continue working with farmers, to gain new knowledge, to stay on top of the most, techniques or fertilizers. I mean, all of these things, the management practices, it's a way for you to stay in the know. Also, enjoyment. Some of you have off-farm work, really love your off-farm work. It's not something that you're necessarily doing just to work, right? You're doing it because it's a passion. And then the disadvantages, unsurprisingly, are balancing off-farm work and farm work. It is really difficult to do both. And so, yeah, that is pretty much what it comes down to. I do want to know, one farmer, whenever it came to off-farm work, they said that there is no way that they would do off-farm work. I just thought that was really interesting because they didn't think that they'd be able to farm. And then the next section